The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I navigated the winding driveway toward Cooper Mansion. It loomed ahead like a relic of another era, its stone facade darkened by the years, ivy creeping up its walls like a hand grasping for control. The air around the estate felt heavy, oppressive. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of its secrets pressing down on me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. I was here for a reason. As the mansion emerged fully into view, it struck me how alive it felt. Watching, waiting, like it was testing me. I had been to grand estates before, but there was something about this place, something dark and lingering, that made my chest tighten. I had seen photos, of course, but nothing prepared me for the sheer scale and cold beauty of it. It felt less like a home and more like a monument to a forgotten time. I parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot barely audible in the suffocating quiet. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling grounds, but none of its warmth reached me. For a brief moment, I hesitated, staring up at the mansion's tall windows reflecting the fading light, wondering what lay within. I was here to care for Leo Cooper, the young son of Hudson Cooper, the mansion's owner. Leo had been in a vegetative state for months, following a tragic accident I knew little about. Hudson had hired me, a private nurse, to provide round-the-clock care. It was a task I didn't take lightly, though there was something unsettling about how urgent they'd been in hiring me. I rang the doorbell, the sound echoing like a warning, and I straightened my posture, determined not to let the mansion's eerie presence unnerve me. Footsteps approached from inside, muffled yet purposeful, and after a moment, the heavy wooden door creaked open. Hudson Cooper stood before me, looking every bit the part of a man burdened by grief and time. His tailored suit couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes, the dark circles beneath them betraying sleepless nights. But his smile, though weary, was warm. Miss Paisley Evans, I presume. His voice was deep, steady, but there was something else beneath it, a vulnerability he couldn't quite conceal. Yes, that's right, I replied, managing the small smile. I could feel his eyes on me, studying, assessing. Please come in, he said, stepping aside. As I entered the grand foyer, the scale of the place overwhelmed me. High ceilings adorned with chandeliers, walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors, all watching me with judgmental eyes. The air was thick with history, and something else, something darker. Hudson led me through the foyer, his steps purposeful but heavy. I'm glad you could start immediately, he said. Leo, he needs the best care, and I believe you're the right person for that. I'll do everything I can, I assured him, though my own pulse quickened at the enormity of the responsibility. As we walked through the dimly lit halls, I found myself studying Hudson more closely. He moved with quiet authority, his hands clasped behind his back. But there was a gentleness to him that surprised me, an aching softness when he spoke of his son. I'll take you to Leo's room, Hudson said, his voice lowering as though speaking of his son required a special reverence. He's been in this state for almost a year now. We've tried everything, different treatments, therapies. His voice trailed off, and the weight of his words settled between us. I glanced at him, noting the pain in his expression. I'm sorry, I said softly, though I sensed Hudson had heard those words too many times already. We turned down a long hallway, and as we neared Leo's room, the temperature seemed to drop. The atmosphere thickened, and the air felt colder, heavier. I couldn't explain it, but something was different here, like this part of the house carried its own secrets. Hudson paused at the door, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. The room was vast, far too large for the small, fragile figure lying in the center of it. Leo's bed, surrounded by medical equipment, looked dwarfed by the space around it. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled the silence, and in the dim light, I could see Leo's pale face, his chest rising and falling slowly, mechanically. This is Leo, Hudson said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. My son. I approached the bed cautiously, taking in the sight of the boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but his small frame made him seem even younger. His skin was almost translucent under the soft glow of the monitors, and his dark hair lay flat against his pillow. "I'll do everything I can for him," I promised, though the weight of those words pressed heavily on my shoulders. Just then, a cold voice cut through the room. "So, the new nurse has arrived." I turned to see a woman standing in the doorway. She was tall, elegant, and severe, her dark hair perfectly styled, her icy blue eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. She didn't smile. "Hazel," Hudson said, his tone shifting, cooling. "This is Leo's stepmother." Hazel's gaze swept over me, critical and appraising. "I hope you're ready for what you've taken on," she said, her voice sharp, almost biting. "Leo's care is demanding. We've had nurses come and go. None of them lasted long." I stood taller, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm prepared for the responsibility, Mrs. Cooper," I said firmly. "I'm here to help Leo in any way I can." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more. Instead, she walked over to the bed and adjusted Leo's blanket with cold precision. "Follow the treatment plan exactly as it's been outlined," she said, her tone clipped. "We've worked closely with Dr. Parker, and his methods are what's best for Leo." "Hazel," Hudson interjected, his voice soft but firm, "Paisley knows what she's doing. Let her do her job." Hazel's eyes flicked toward him, narrowing slightly, but she didn't argue. She straightened and turned toward the door. "I'll check in later," she said, her voice icy as she left the room. I glanced at Hudson, who ran a hand through his hair, looking both exhausted and frustrated. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "Hazel, she's been very involved in Leo's care." "I understand," I replied carefully, though I sensed there was much more to the tension between them than Hudson was letting on. Hudson gave me a tired smile, filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for being here. It means more than you know." As he left me alone with Leo, I felt the full weight of the mansion's secrets pressing in on me. There was so much pain in this house, so much sorrow. And somehow I knew this was only the beginning. Whatever had brought me here was far more dangerous than I had realized. The first few days at Cooper Mansion passed in a strange, unsettling calm. The silence of the place wasn't merely the absence of noise. It felt alive, like the mansion itself was watching. Leo's room, in particular, held a stillness that weighed heavily on me. I followed the prescribed routines diligently, checking his vitals, administering medications, and adjusting the machines that kept him tethered to this world. Yet, through it all, something felt off, something beyond the clinical facts of his condition. The rhythmic beeping of Leo's heart monitor became a soundtrack to the long hours I spent by his side. Despite the best efforts of doctors, specialists, and now myself, his body lay motionless, the small twitches of life almost imperceptible. But there was more to Leo than met the eye. Even in his stillness, I could sense a presence, a lingering awareness beneath the surface, as if he were trapped behind a veil, waiting for someone to reach through. I often wondered what his life had been like before the accident, before this room had become his prison. Hudson rarely spoke of it, and Hazel, with her cold, distant demeanor, refused to share any details beyond the necessary. She appeared only to ensure I was following the treatment plan precisely, her sharp gaze always tracking my movements, as though expecting me to falter. There was no warmth in her interactions, only control. One afternoon, she appeared in the doorway without warning, her silhouette framed by the shadows of the hallway. "Any progress?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. I looked up from adjusting one of Leo's bandages, meeting her critical stare. "None so far. His condition is stable, but there haven't been any signs of improvement." Hazel crossed her arms, her fingers tapping impatiently against her sleeve. "Stable isn't enough," she said coldly. "He needs to improve. You should follow Dr. Parker's suggestions more closely. I've been managing Leo's care for months now. I know what works." I suppressed the irritation rising in my chest and chose my words carefully. These things take time. Leo's condition is complex. I'm doing everything I can. Hazel's eyes narrowed, the air between us thick with tension. We don't have time, she said sharply. Leo doesn't have time. She didn't wait for my response. With a swirl of her tailored dress, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. I exhaled, feeling the suffocating weight of her presence lift as she disappeared from sight. But her words echoed in my mind. We don't have time. What did she mean by that? Was there something she wasn't telling me? Her impatience, her insistence that things happen quickly, it didn't sit right with me. There was more to Leo's condition than the medical records revealed. And the longer I spent in this house, the more I felt that Hazel wasn't just worried about his health. She was hiding something. Later that evening, the mansion was as quiet as ever. Hudson had stopped by briefly, his usual warmth evident in his brief conversation with me before he retired for the night. He seemed grateful for my presence, for my dedication to Leo, but there was a weariness about him too, a man stretched thin by grief and responsibility. After the house had settled into its nightly routine, I found myself sitting beside Leo's bed once more. The dim light from the bedside lamp cast a soft glow across his face, and I watched his chest rise and fall, the machine's steady rhythm, now a comforting, if eerie, presence. I reached out, gently taking his hand in mine. His skin was cool to the touch, fragile, as though the life within him was fading, slipping away each day. I held on to that small connection, hoping that somehow, in some distant part of his consciousness, he could feel that he wasn't alone. And then it happened. A twitch. Barely there, but I felt it. Leo's fingers moved. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at his hand, willing it to move again, unsure if I had imagined it. The silence in the room suddenly became deafening, the steady beep of the heart monitor fading into the background as I focused solely on Leo. Then, another twitch, this time more deliberate. Leo, I whispered, my heart racing. I leaned in closer, my voice soft but urgent. Leo, can you hear me? If you can, try to move again. For a long moment, nothing happened. The stillness returned, the oppressive quiet pressing down on me. But just as I began to doubt what I had seen, his eyelids fluttered. Slowly, hesitantly, Leo blinked. A gasp escaped my lips, disbelief and hope swirling within me. Leo, you're here, I whispered, my voice trembling. You can hear me, can't you? There was no response, no words, but I could feel it. Something had shifted. Leo wasn't just a body kept alive by machines. He was there, trapped beneath the surface, trying to reach out. I wanted to scream for Hudson, to call the doctors, to tell everyone that Leo was waking up. But something stopped me. A nagging voice in the back of my mind. A memory of the way Leo's body had stiffened whenever Hazel entered the room, of the subtle fear that seemed to linger whenever she was near. I couldn't explain it, but something about her made me hesitate. No, I couldn't tell anyone yet, not until I understood what was happening. Instead, I tightened my grip on Leo's hand, leaning closer. You're safe, Leo, I whispered, my voice filled with a determination I hadn't realized was there. I'm going to figure out what's going on, I promise. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, the house quiet save for the soft hum of the machines. But my mind was spinning. I couldn't shake the feeling that Leo had tried to tell me something, that his movements weren't just random reflexes. There was something deeper happening here, something more dangerous than I had anticipated. And I was determined to uncover it, whatever it took. A week had passed since the first signs of Leo's responsiveness. Each day, I sat beside his bed, watching, waiting for another twitch of his hand or flutter of his eyelids, but there had been no further movement. His condition remained unchanged, at least outwardly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring beneath the surface. I hadn't told anyone about what I had witnessed, not even Hudson. There was something about this house, about Hazel, that made me feel like I had to tread carefully. The mansion, with its grand halls and looming shadows, seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the inevitable storm to break. Hudson's kindness was a constant, but even he seemed distant at times, preoccupied with his own thoughts. Hazel's presence, however, had grown more oppressive. She hovered over me whenever I was with Leo, watching with those cold, calculating eyes. It was as if she was waiting for me to make a mistake. One afternoon, as I went through Leo's medication routine, something unusual caught my eye. The shelves in the cabinet were neatly arranged, each vial and bottle carefully labeled and accounted for. But as I reached for Leo's next dose, I noticed a small unlabeled vial tucked at the very back, hidden behind the others. My pulse quickened. The vial was different from the rest, its glass cloudy, the liquid inside a strange pale yellow color. It didn't match any of the prescribed medications I had been instructed to give Leo. My first instinct was to assume it was some kind of mistake, perhaps an old medication that had been forgotten. But something about it felt off. Why was it hidden? Why wasn't it labeled? My mind raced with possibilities. Could this be something Hazel had introduced without informing the doctors? I tried to recall if I had ever seen her handling medications, but nothing concrete came to mind. Yet there was that lingering feeling, that sense of unease every time she was near Leo. I carefully placed the vial back on the shelf, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't just ignore this. Whatever this vial contained, it wasn't part of the official treatment plan. But if I asked Hazel about it directly, I had no doubt she'd brush it off, or worse, turn it against me. I needed more information. As I stood there, contemplating my next move, I heard footsteps approaching. I quickly closed the cabinet and turned to see Hazel standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes immediately sweeping over the room, then locking onto me. "Paisley," she said, her voice as clipped and cold as ever. "How's Leo doing?" I swallowed, forcing myself to remain calm. "No significant changes," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "He's stable." Hazel stepped closer, her gaze lingering on the medication cabinet before she turned to look at Leo. "Stable isn't enough," she muttered under her breath, though I wasn't sure if she meant for me to hear. Her fingers drummed against her arm as she stood at the foot of Leo's bed, staring at him with an intensity that unsettled me. "He's getting the best care," I said, trying to gauge her reaction. "I'm following the treatment plan exactly." "Good," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. There was something else in her expression, a tension that hadn't been there before. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes narrowing. "It's important that everything is done precisely. We can't afford any mistakes." I nodded, though her words sent a shiver down my spine. She lingered for a moment longer, then, without another word, turned and left the room, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. I exhaled, not realizing I had been holding my breath. The moment she was gone, I went back to the cabinet. My hand hesitated as I reached for the vial again. But I couldn't let this go. Whatever this liquid was, I needed to know more. I slipped the vial into my pocket, my mind racing with questions. Was this the reason Leo hadn't improved? Was Hazel giving him something that was keeping him in this state? The thought made my stomach churn. If she was doing something behind Hudson's back, something dangerous, I had to find out before it was too late. Later that night, when the house had fallen into its usual eerie stillness, I crept back into Leo's room. The faint glow of the monitors cast long shadows across the walls. But I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to risk anyone discovering what I was about to do. With the vial still hidden in my pocket, I began searching through the cabinet again, carefully checking each label, each bottle. Everything seemed in order, except for one other small vial, identical to the one I had found earlier. It was tucked away behind a stack of medical supplies, just as hidden as the first. My heart raced as I pulled it out and examined it. There was no label, no markings, Nothing to indicate what it was. Two identical vials, hidden from view. It couldn't be a coincidence. I stood there, staring at the vials in my hands, when I heard a voice behind me. "What are you doing?" I spun around, startled, to see Hazel standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression tight with suspicion. I stammered, quickly slipping one of the vials back into the cabinet. I was checking Leo's medications. Hazel's eyes flicked to the cabinet, her gaze darkening. "Everything should be in order," she said, her voice low. "Is there a problem?" I swallowed hard, holding up the remaining vial. "I found this," I said carefully, "but it doesn't have a label. I was wondering if you knew what it was." Hazel's face tightened, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or anger. But she recovered quickly, her expression hardening. "That's part of a special regimen Dr. Parker recommended," she said smoothly. "There's no need for concern. It's all been approved." I didn't believe her. Something about her answer felt too rehearsed, too convenient. I wasn't aware of it. I said, my voice steady but laced with suspicion, "Shouldn't I be informed about everything Leo is being given?" Hazel's eyes narrowed. "You're here to follow instructions, Paisley," she said, her voice cold. "Leo's treatment is being handled. Don't overstep." The warning in her voice was clear, and I knew there was no point in pressing her further, not now, at least. But as Hazel left the room, I was certain of one thing. She was hiding something that could explain why Leo wasn't improving. As I sat back down beside Leo's bed, I looked at him, so still, so vulnerable. Whatever was happening in this house, I was determined to uncover the truth. Leo's life depended on it. The days at Cooper Mansion passed in a haze of tension and secrecy, each one more suffocating than the last. I could feel the weight of something looming, like the air itself had grown heavier. I had found 2 hidden vials in Leo's medication cabinet, and I was certain now that Hazel was doing something behind Hudson's back, something she didn't want anyone, especially me, to discover. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was in Leo's room, adjusting the monitors that had become a constant in my daily routine. The soft beep of the machines was the only sound in the room when suddenly the front door of the mansion slammed open with a crash that echoed down the hall. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as voices, loud and angry, broke the usual stillness. "I'm here to see my son." I didn't recognize the voice, but it was filled with desperation, the kind of desperation that comes from years of pain and separation. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping out into the hallway, drawn to the commotion unfolding near the foyer. Hudson stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, his face pale and drawn. In front of him was a woman I had never seen before, her auburn hair flowing down her back, her eyes burning with a fierce determination that sent a chill through me. "Bottom." Hudson's voice was barely more than a whisper, a mixture of surprise and something darker. Regret, perhaps. "Autumn." Leo's biological mother. The woman who had been absent for so long, now standing in the mansion she clearly had no desire to be in. Her gaze flicked toward me briefly before locking onto Hudson, her expression unreadable but intense. "I'm here to see Leo," she repeated, her voice hard, unwavering. "You've kept me away long enough, Hudson. I deserve to see my son." Hudson's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he seemed smaller, diminished. "It's complicated," he said softly, his eyes flicking toward the staircase as though expecting someone. "Hazel, no doubt, to descend at any moment. Leo's condition, it hasn't changed. I don't want you to get your hopes up." Autumn took a step forward, her hands trembling as she balled them into fists at her sides. "I don't care about your excuses. I've heard things. I know Hazel's been controlling everything. His care, his treatment, who gets to see him. But that ends today." The air in the room crackled with tension, and I could see Hudson struggling, torn between his loyalty to Hazel and his guilt over keeping Autumn from her son. As I moved closer, staying out of sight, but close enough to hear. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of history lay between them. What kind of wounds had been left open all these years? Just then, as if summoned by the tension in the air, Hazel appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her eyes immediately locking onto Autumn. Her presence seemed to fill the room with a cold, heavy weight, and I saw the muscles in Hudson's back tense as Hazel began her slow descent down the stairs. "Well, well," Hazel said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "Look who's decided to grace us with her presence." "How unexpected." Autumn's gaze didn't waver, though I could see the fire in her eyes intensifying. "I'm not here for your games, Hazel. I'm here for Leo. I'm his mother, and I have every right to see him." Hazel's expression didn't change, but there was something dangerous in her posture, something possessive. "You abandoned him," she said coolly. "You left him when he needed you the most. And now you think you can just waltz back into his life and play the role of a concerned mother. I didn't abandon him." Autumn's voice cracked, her words raw with emotion. "I was forced out. You manipulated Hudson, twisted everything to make sure I had no say in his life. But I'm still his mother." Hudson took a step forward, his voice soft but pleading. "Autumn, please, this isn't the time. Leo's condition hasn't improved. I don't want you to get hurt." Autumn shook her head, her expression resolute. "I don't care what you or Hazel think is best. I'm not leaving this house until I see Leo. I'm done with being kept away." Hazel's eyes gleamed with something dark, her fingers gripping the banister tightly as she finished descending the stairs. "You want to see him," she said, her voice smooth but cutting. "Fine. Be my guest. But don't say I didn't warn you. He's not the boy you remember, and no amount of motherly love is going to change that." The venom in Hazel's words made my stomach churn, but Autumn didn't flinch. She brushed past Hazel without another word, her gaze fixed on the hallway that led to Leo's room. Hudson, looking defeated, followed her, his steps heavy with resignation. Hazel remained where she was, her icy stare following Autumn like a shadow. I quickly stepped back into Leo's room, my heart racing. This was the first time Autumn had been in this house in years. Her presence alone was enough to shatter the fragile balance Hazel had so carefully crafted. I had no doubt that her return would stir up old wounds, bring buried secrets to the surface, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. The door creaked open, and I stepped aside as Autumn entered the room, her breath catching as she saw her son lying motionless in the bed. Her face softened, and for the first time, I saw the raw pain behind her fierce exterior. "Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling as she approached the bed. She reached out with a trembling hand, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Leo, of course, didn't respond. His chest rose and fell in the slow, mechanical way it always did, his face peaceful but distant, as though he were somewhere far away, unreachable. But the emotion in Autumn's eyes told me everything I needed to know. This was the moment she had waited for, the chance to reconnect, to reclaim the bond that had been severed. "I won't leave you again," Autumn whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I promise, Leo. I'm here for you now." Hazel appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression hard and unyielding. "Touching," she said, her voice thick with disdain. "But it's too late. Leo is beyond your reach now." Autumn's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with fury. "You don't get to decide that," she spat. "You've had your control for long enough, Hazel. But it's over. I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." The tension in the room was palpable, and I could feel the power struggle between the two women, the years of bitterness and resentment bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just about Leo. This was about control, about claiming what each believed to be rightfully theirs. Hudson stepped in, his voice weary and strained. "Enough," he said, his tone pleading. "We'll figure this out, but not like this." But neither Hazel nor Autumn seemed to hear him. They stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, each refusing to back down. I stayed close, watching, waiting. I had a front-row seat to a war that had been brewing for years, a war that would only grow more dangerous with time. And as I looked at Leo, lying helpless in his bed, I knew that whatever was about to unfold would change everything. This was only the beginning of the storm. Autumn's return had shaken the foundations of Cooper Mansion. Every day since her arrival had been filled with an undercurrent of tension, the air thick with unspoken accusations and barely concealed resentment. The fragile peace that once held the household together was rapidly disintegrating, and no amount of polite conversation or forced civility could hide it. Hazel's icy demeanor became sharper with every passing hour, her interactions with both Hudson and me becoming colder, more clipped. She refused to acknowledge Autumn's presence beyond the occasional biting remark, though her eyes betrayed her, flashing with anger every time she looked at her. Hudson, meanwhile, seemed caught between the two women, his attempts to mediate their conflict growing more desperate and ineffective with each passing day. But beneath the surface drama, something more sinister was happening. The discovery of the hidden vials had gnawed at me relentlessly, and I could no longer ignore the sense of dread that accompanied every visit to Leo's room. There was something in those vials, something that wasn't part of his official treatment, and I had to know what it was. Late one evening, when the mansion was shrouded in darkness and everyone else had retired to their rooms, I made my move. I had memorized the layout of Leo's medical cabinet, and I knew exactly where the vials were hidden. The soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminated the stark room as I worked quickly, quietly retrieving the vials and slipping them into my pocket. I had no idea what was in them, but I had to find out. This was more than just a gut feeling. Leo's life might be at stake. My heart raced as I made my way to the study, where Hudson had left some of Leo's old medical reports. I knew I wouldn't be able to analyze the vials myself, but if I could cross-reference the medications, maybe I could figure out if these vials were listed anywhere, or if they were something entirely unknown. The study was dimly lit, its walls lined with books and framed photographs of a life that seemed so far removed from the cold reality of Leo's condition. I moved quickly, rifling through the drawers of Hudson's desk, looking for anything that might give me a clue. Medical reports, doctor's notes, treatment plans, anything. Just as I found a thick folder marked Leo Cooper, treatment history, I heard footsteps approaching. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, listening. The footsteps were light, deliberate. Hazel's, no doubt. She had always moved like a predator, her presence announced by the faint clicking of her heels. I slipped the folder into my bag and quickly hid behind a large armchair, holding my breath. The door creaked open, and Hazel stepped into the room, her silhouette framed by the soft glow from the hallway. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room as though she could sense that something was amiss. I remained perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, Hazel finally turned and left the study, her footsteps fading into the distance. I exhaled shakily, my pulse still racing. I couldn't afford to get caught, not now. Not when I was so close to the truth. Once I was certain she was gone, I slipped out of the study and hurried back to my room. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled out the folder and began flipping through the pages. The treatment plans were extensive, each one meticulously detailed. There were notes from doctors, lists of medications, and descriptions of therapies Leo had undergone in the months following his accident. But as I skimmed through the documents, one thing became clear. There was no mention of the vials anywhere. Whatever Hazel had been giving Leo, it wasn't part of his official treatment. It had been hidden, kept off the books, just like the vials themselves. A chill ran down my spine. What was Hazel doing? Why would she hide something like this? And more importantly, what was in those vials? I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The next morning, after checking on Leo and ensuring that Hazel was nowhere in sight, I made my way to Hudson's study once more. This time, I was determined to confront him. He deserved to know what was happening under his own roof. Hudson was sitting at his desk when I entered, his face lined with exhaustion. He looked up as I approached, concern immediately flickering in his eyes. "Paisley," he said, setting aside a stack of papers. "Is something wrong? Is it Leo?" I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to say could change everything. "Hudson, I found something," I said, my voice steady but urgent. "Something in Leo's medication cabinet that I don't think you're aware of." Hudson's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward. "What do you mean?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out one of the vials, placing it on the desk in front of him. His eyes widened as he stared at it, confusion written across his face. "This," I explained, "was hidden behind the prescribed medications. I found several of them. There's no label, no documentation, nothing. And they're not listed in any of Leo's treatment plans." Hudson picked up the vial, turning it over in his hands. What is this?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but Hazel said it was part of a special regimen recommended by Dr. Parker. Yet there's no mention of it anywhere in Leo's medical history." Hudson's face paled, his hand tightening around the vial. "You're saying Hazel's been giving Leo something without my knowledge?" I nodded, watching the realization dawn on him. "I don't know what her motives are, but whatever it is, it's not part of the official treatment. Leo's condition hasn't improved, and I'm starting to think this might be why." Hudson's expression darkened, a mixture of disbelief and anger flashing across his features. How could she? Before he could finish his thought, the door to the study creaked open, and Hazel stepped inside, her eyes immediately locking onto the vial in Hudson's hand. Her face tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than cold control. Panic. "What's going on?" Hazel asked, her voice unnaturally calm, though the tension in her posture betrayed her. "Hudson, why do you have that?" Hudson rose to his feet, his voice low but trembling with restrained fury. "What have you been giving Leo, Hazel? What is this?" Hazel's eyes flicked toward me, narrowing. "Paisley's been filling your head with nonsense, hasn't she? That vial is part of a supplement regimen. It's harmless. I've been in contact with specialists." I stepped forward, refusing to back down. "If it's harmless, why wasn't it listed in Leo's treatment plan? Why was it hidden?" Hazel's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice smooth, controlled. "Because not everyone needs to know every detail. Paisley, you're a nurse. You follow instructions. That's all." My jaw clenched. Leo deserves transparency. You can't keep secrets about his care. Hudson's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Hazel, I need the truth. No more lies." For a moment, Hazel's composure faltered, her eyes flicking between us, her lips pressed into a thin line. But before she could respond, the door burst open once more, and Autumn stormed into the room, her face flushed with anger. "What the hell is going on in here?" she demanded, her voice sharp as she marched toward us. "What are you hiding from me?" The room was suddenly thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Hazel stepped back, her face a mask of cold control once more, while Hudson looked torn, caught between the two women. Autumn's gaze landed on the vial in Hudson's hand, and her expression darkened. "What is that?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. The truth was finally starting to unravel, but as I looked at the faces around me, I realized that we were only scratching the surface. There were deeper secrets buried in this house, secrets that Hazel had fought so hard to keep hidden. And now that they were starting to come to light, I could only hope it wasn't too late for Leo. The atmosphere in the mansion had become unbearable. Every interaction felt like it teetered on the edge of an explosion, and every conversation was laced with the weight of secrets. Since the confrontation in Hudson's study, there had been no further discussion about the mysterious vials, though I knew that the battle lines had been drawn. Hazel was furious, Autumn was relentless, and Hudson, he seemed lost, caught between two forces that threatened to tear his world apart. But through it all, Leo lay motionless in his bed, his pale face illuminated only by the soft glow of the machines that sustained him. It was easy to forget, amid all the chaos, that he was the heart of it all, that his life hung in the balance while everyone around him fought for control. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of his hand twitching in mine, of his eyelids fluttering as if trying to break free from whatever dark place he was trapped in. That afternoon, as the storm outside raged and the mansion felt even more oppressive, I found myself sitting beside Leo again, as I always did, my fingers tracing the lines of his delicate hand. The rain beat against the tall windows, and for a moment the rhythmic sound was soothing. But then something shifted. Leo's hand twitched. Not the faint, fleeting movement I had seen before, but a deliberate twitch, as though he were trying to move. I leaned forward, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. "Leo," I whispered, barely able to contain the hope in my voice. "Leo, can you hear me?" His fingers twitched again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I squeezed his hand gently, willing him to respond, to show me that I wasn't imagining it. "Leo, if you can hear me, if you're there, move again." For a moment, nothing happened. The room was still, save for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. But then, slowly, his eyelids fluttered, and with visible effort, they opened. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His eyes, glazed and unfocused, slowly roamed the space, blinking as though adjusting to the dim light. "Leo," I whispered again, my voice trembling with disbelief. "Leo, can you hear me?" His lips parted, but no sound came out. I leaned closer, my pulse pounding in my ears as I watched his chest rise and fall with more urgency. It was as if he were trying to force his way back to consciousness, struggling to free himself from the prison his body had become. "Dad?" Leo's voice was faint, barely more than a breath. But it was there, real, unmistakable. Tears welled up in my eyes. "Leo, it's me, Paisley. You're safe. You're awake." Leo's eyes moved slowly, finally landing on me, and for the briefest moment, they cleared. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, fragile, but it cut through the thick air like a shout. I reached for his hand, holding it firmly in mine. "You're at home, Leo. You've been in an accident, but you're safe now." His brow furrowed, his face a mask of confusion and fear. I can't move," he whispered, his voice trembling with panic. My heart ached at the fear in his voice. "It's okay," I said quickly, trying to soothe him. "You've been in a coma for a while, but you're waking up now. You'll be okay. We'll figure this out together." Leo blinked, struggling to process my words. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the machines surrounding him. His breathing quickened, and I could see the terror building in his expression. "What's happening? Why can't I move?" I tightened my grip on his hand, leaning closer to him. "You're safe, Leo. I'm here. Your dad is here too. Everything's going to be okay." Just then, the door to the room creaked open, and Hazel stepped inside. Her eyes went wide when she saw Leo's open eyes, and for a moment, she froze, her face a mixture of shock and something else. "Fear." "Leo." Hazel's voice was sharp, almost panicked as she rushed to the bedside. "You're awake. But Leo's reaction was immediate and visceral. His body tensed, and his breathing quickened even more. No. His voice was weak, but the panic in it was unmistakable. Hazel reached for him, but I instinctively stepped in between them, shielding Leo from her touch. "Hazel, stop," I said, my voice firm. "He's scared." Hazel's eyes flashed with anger, and for a brief moment, I saw the mask of control slip. "Scared?" she snapped. "He's confused. I'm his mother. He needs to hear my voice, not yours." Leo's voice cut through the tension, strained but clear. "Where's my mom?" His words trembled with fear, but they were laced with something else. Urgency. Hazel's face paled, her mouth opening in protest, but no sound came out. I glanced at Leo, his eyes wide and desperate, his body trembling. "I want to see my real mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Hazel stepped back, her expression hardening into one of cold anger. "Leo, listen to me. I've been the one caring for you." But Leo's reaction was instant. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I want my real mom. I don't want you." I looked at Hazel, her face contorted with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She took a deep breath, her eyes flicking between me and Leo, as though calculating her next move. "He doesn't know what he's saying," Hazel spat, her voice shaking. "He's confused, Paisley. You can't let him make decisions right now." But I could see the truth in Leo's eyes. He wasn't confused, he was terrified. I stepped closer to the bed, keeping myself between Leo and Hazel. "He's awake, Hazel," I said softly, my voice firm but calm. "He's aware of what's happening, and he's asking for his mother." Hazel's face twisted in anger, her hands trembling at her sides. "You don't understand what's at stake here. You're just a nurse. You don't know what's best for him." I looked at Leo, his eyes wide and pleading, and made a decision. "I'm going to get Autumn," I said quietly. Hazel's expression shifted into something dark and dangerous. "Don't you dare." But before she could stop me, I slipped out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm outside had grown louder, the wind howling as I made my way down the hall to find Autumn. She was in her room, pacing nervously by the window when I knocked. "Autumn," I said breathlessly, "you need to come with me. It's Leo. He's awake, and he's asking for you." Autumn turned to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "He's awake." I nodded, and before I could say another word, she rushed past me, her footsteps echoing down the hall. By the time I returned to Leo's room, Autumn was already by his side, tears streaming down her face as she took his hand in hers. "Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Leo's face softened, and for the first time since he had woken up, I saw a flicker of peace in his expression. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're here." Autumn leaned over, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I'm here, Leo. I'm not going anywhere." As I watched them, I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived, because out of the corner of my eye, I saw Hazel standing in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within these walls, and I knew that the battle for Leo's future had only just begun. The storm outside had become a full-blown tempest, the wind howling and rain lashing against the windows of Cooper Mansion. But the storm inside the house, between the people who claimed to love Leo, was far more dangerous. As I stood in the doorway of Leo's room, watching the emotional reunion between him and Autumn, I could feel the air crackling with the weight of all the lies, secrets, and betrayals that had been festering for months, maybe even years. Hazel hadn't said a word since Autumn entered the room. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a cold mask of fury and frustration. Her eyes flicked between Autumn and Leo, narrowing with each second, and I could feel the anger radiating off her like heat from a fire. This was the moment she had been dreading, losing control of the situation, losing her grip on Leo. I could almost see her calculating her next move. "Mom," Leo whispered again, his voice raw with emotion, barely able to speak through his tears. His fragile body trembled slightly, but the peace that came with his mother's presence was unmistakable. "I missed you." Autumn's face was streaked with tears, her hands gently stroking Leo's hair. "I'm here now, sweetheart. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere ever again." As Autumn leaned in closer to Leo, whispering comforting words, Hazel stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. The sound shattered the moment of peace, and Autumn stiffened, her back straightening as she sensed Hazel's approach. "That's enough." Hazel's voice was cold and biting. "You've said your goodbyes. You need to leave now." Autumn turned to face Hazel, her expression hardening in an instant. Goodbyes, she spat, her voice shaking with anger. I'm not leaving him, Hazel. I'm his mother. Hazel's eyes flashed dangerously, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I've been the one caring for him, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. I've been the one keeping him alive all this time. Where were you when he needed you? You abandoned him, Mom. Autumn rose to her feet, squaring her shoulders as she faced Hazel head-on. I never abandoned him, she said, her voice steady and firm. You made sure I had no choice. You manipulated Hudson. You twisted everything so that I couldn't see my own son. But that's over now. Leo is awake, and I'm not leaving him again. Hazel's face contorted with rage, her eyes narrowing to slits. You think you can just waltz back in here and take him away from me? I've done everything for him, sacrificed everything. You don't get to come back and pretend you care now. Hudson, who had been standing silently in the corner, finally stepped forward, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. Hazel, he said quietly, his voice shaky. This isn't the time. But Hazel cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. No, she snapped. You don't get to be the voice of reason now, Hudson. You let this happen. You let her come back and ruin everything we've built. Built. Autumn's voice trembled with barely controlled rage. You've built nothing but lies, Hazel. You've kept Leo trapped in this house, in this state, for your own selfish reasons. Hazel's eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of her desperation. I kept him alive, she said, her voice dangerously low. I did what I had to do. Leo was never going to recover, not without my help. Autumn stepped closer to Hazel, her eyes blazing. What help? She demanded, her voice rising. What have you been doing to him? For a moment, the room fell deathly silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Hazel's face was pale, her eyes darting between us, as though searching for an escape. Her lips trembled, but she quickly regained her composure, her cold mask slipping back into place. He's better off with me, Hazel said finally, her voice icy. I know what's best for him. But before she could continue, I stepped forward, the words tumbling out of me before I could stop them. You've been giving him something, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Those vials, they weren't part of his treatment. What have you been doing to him, Hazel? Hazel's face went ashen, her eyes widening in shock. You don't know what you're talking about, she said quickly, her voice faltering for the first time. But I pressed on. Those vials, whatever you've been giving him, it wasn't in his official treatment plan. I found them hidden in his medication cabinet, Hazel. You've been hiding them from Hudson, from the doctors, from everyone. Hudson's face drained of color as he stared at Hazel, his voice barely a whisper. Hazel, is that true? For the briefest moment, Hazel's composure crumbled, her eyes flicking toward Hudson, and I saw something raw and broken in her expression. But she quickly recovered, straightening her shoulders and turning her cold gaze back to me. You don't understand, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Leo was slipping away. He was never going to recover with the standard treatment. I had to do something drastic. I couldn't just let him go. Autumn's voice was sharp as she stepped closer. What have you been giving him? Hazel's eyes flicked toward Leo, who lay quietly on the bed, his face still pale, but his eyes open, and watching the scene unfold. Her lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. It's an experimental treatment, she said. Something I found through one of Dr. Parker's contacts. It wasn't approved, but it was the only chance he had. My heart sank as the full weight of her words hit me. You've been experimenting on him, I whispered, my voice filled with horror. Hazel shook her head quickly, her eyes wild. No, I've been saving him. Without it, he would have never woken up. Autumn's face was filled with disgust, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the door. You need to leave, she said, her voice cold and final. Now. Hazel's face twisted with fury, her hands shaking as she took a step toward Autumn. "You can't make me leave. I've done everything for him." Hudson, his voice firm but quiet, finally stepped between them. "Hazel," he said softly, his face filled with sadness. "It's over. You've crossed a line, and I can't let you hurt him anymore." Hazel's eyes filled with tears, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I did this for him, for all of us." But as she looked around the room, she realized the battle was lost. Autumn stood protectively by Leo's side, her face hard and unyielding. Hudson's gaze was filled with sorrow, but there was no trace of forgiveness left. And Leo, though weak and barely able to speak, had made his wishes clear. He wanted his mother, his real mother. Hazel's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw the weight of her guilt and desperation crash down on her. She turned to me, her voice a broken whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt him." I stepped forward, my voice steady. "I believe you didn't want to hurt him, Hazel. But whatever you've done, it's time to stop." Hazel stood there for a moment longer, her eyes darting between us, before she finally lowered her head in defeat. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps heavy and slow as they echoed down the hall. The storm outside seemed to calm slightly as she disappeared from sight, the oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion finally beginning to lift. Autumn turned to Leo, her face softening as she took his hand in hers. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I'm here." Leo's eyes fluttered closed, his body finally relaxing as the tension drained from the room. I stood by the door, watching them, a sense of relief washing over me. But I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Leo's recovery would be long and difficult, and the emotional scars from everything that had happened in this house would take time to heal. But for the first time, there was hope. As the storm outside finally began to break, I looked out the window, watching as the dark clouds slowly parted, allowing a thin ray of sunlight to break through. The nightmare that had haunted Cooper Mansion was far from over, but at least for now, we had won this battle.